Hello and welcome to this AC education presentation entitled Understanding and Calming Anxiety in Children in this time of the coronavirus pandemic. My name is Sheila Mulvaney. I am one of the trainers for AC Education. My background is a nurse, a health visitor, a teacher, and then more latterly I've been head of Virtual School for Children and Care in a number of different authorities. I'm also an author and I've written a book called Overcoming Barriers to Learning. So the presentation is only going to last about 20 minutes. It is designed for parents and carers who are dealing with children during this time who may be experiencing anxiety. However, I think we do need to also point out that this is not designed to specifically be focusing on children that have a kind of defined anxiety disorder. If you are caring for those children, or if you have children with special educational needs and disabilities, where part of one of their conditions might be anxiety, then really, obviously, you need to just keep following the medical and health advice that you've had from the people that are overseeing them, really. So that said, we will launch in for this presentation. So I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully this will go smoothly and we will move on with the presentation. Just share the screen. Okay, I'll just get it from the beginning. Hopefully it's going to do the clip. There we go, it's gone. Okay, so as I said, the title is Understanding and Calming Anxiety in Children During the Time of Coronavirus. So first of all, we'll just go over what we're going to cover. We're going to look at the current context. I think there's no doubt that these are quite unusual times. We're going to look very briefly at the fact that one of the greatest ways to help children calm is for them to have calm adults that they can co-regulate and calm with. We're going to look at how anxiety in kids and in young people can show itself. We're also going to look at two aspects of calming children. One is when the child is in quite a crisis or a meltdown, and the other is how to build in regular activities to their routine that will help them actually calm down. So the first thing is just to talk about anxiety. Obviously, it's very individual. Some people experience a lot more anxiety than others. Some children are much more anxious than others about all sorts of everyday things. Some people are much better at developing strategies that help them deal with anxiety, and others aren't. And of course, the things that cause anxiety varies tremendously from one individual to another. If you were to talk with your friends, you might find that actually what makes you really, really nervous wouldn't affect someone else. So things like maybe a job interview, someone could get very nervous about. Other people wouldn't find that same thing very nerve-wracking at all. It also varies. It varies from one person to another and from one child to another, but it also varies over time in terms of one particular day or one particular period in your life. You might get very anxious about certain things, and then moving on a little bit in a different situation, those things you find you might become much more comfortable with. So the current context, my goodness, it's a strange one, isn't it? We are all experiencing a very unusual, unprecedented situation. So at the minute, it's a constantly changing situation. And I think that makes it very difficult for a lot of people to cope with, obviously adults as well as children. We turn the news on for the briefing, and a lot of days we'll find things have changed. It's also a situation that is totally beyond our control. Whether we like it or not, we are caught in the middle of this. It's not something that we anticipated, but here we are having to deal with it. And that is another thing that can make anxiety much more acute. It's also very unpredictable. We quite genuinely don't know what's going to happen next. So that's another thing that can make this incredibly anxiety producing for a lot of people. And of course, for children, we've seen an awful lot of changes, quite quick changes for them, not only in terms of, say, schools being closed, but also their parents may be having to work more hours if they're a key worker, for example, and people are off sick, or may be out of work, or may suddenly be working from home. So there's all sorts of changes and unpredictabilities within it. There's also no sense of timescale. I know that's one I find quite tough. You know, a lot of people have had letters saying they must self-isolate till I think it's the middle of June. But we gather from some of the news briefings that it could go on considerably longer. And not having a sense of timescale, not knowing with certainty when this period will end, is something that can also cause a lot of anxiety for people. But one of the things particularly that makes it difficult is a lot of the ways that we would get support to cope with anxiety are changing too. So if you're feeling anxious, a common thing to do would be to kind of call up a friend, go and sit and have a chat, talk through what's making you anxious, get them to help you. And of course, at the minute, that is something that's quite difficult to do. We can do it in different ways, and we'll come to those later. But a lot of our usual support perhaps isn't as accessible as it would usually be. So, on the other hand, though, we have a situation, and this is definitely helping some people. It's something I reassure myself with a lot. We are all in this together. There is not a person, we might have a different pathway within it, but there's not a person that isn't having to cope with this, not only in this country, but actually in most of the countries in the world. So it is a shared and a common experience of the whole community. And sometimes that can make it easier to deal with. We can kind of reassure ourselves by reminding ourselves that most everybody else we know is also having to deal with this. Okay, but anxiety, as well as it differs from person to person, it's also very personal. So feel free to stop the video if you want now and just think for a minute, what is it that is making you anxious right now? It could be all sorts of different things, but give yourself a minute, just pause the video, write down, or at least think of some of the things that you're anxious about right now. Okay, welcome back. If you did pause it, there are so many different things that people are anxious about at the moment. Health is a big one for a lot of people, but also a lot of people have money worries. They're not sure if their job is going to continue. There is a whole loss of not seeing family and friends, and perhaps not seeing family and friends who themselves are vulnerable. So there's a bit of a worry about when we'll see them again. Will they be okay? What happens if they get ill? But there are other issues around. A lot of parents are worrying about how their children are coping, worrying maybe about how they're going to cope with having the children at home all the time, or for other people, how they're going to manage their increased workload if they are working in particular sectors that are under pressure. And then there are the very straightforward worries about things like money. That's that's uppermost in a lot of people's minds, and also things like, will there be enough food? Will there be shortage of certain items that maybe they like or their children like? Will they have to go further afield to get them, and will they be able to? So there's a whole lot of things, and I haven't covered everything by any means. So there are a whole lot of things that people might be feeling anxious about at the moment. Some of those things children will pick up on and be anxious about, but there might be other things that children are anxious about. So again, you can feel free to pause here for a moment. Do you know what's making the children or young people that you're caring for anxious? Have they mentioned it to you? Have they talked about it? If they haven't, then if you had to guess, what do you think it would be? Now, it would be useful at some point to talk to the young people you're with about what's making them anxious, not in terms of creating further anxieties for them, but obviously one of the ways that you can reassure them is understanding what it is that they're anxious about. So we'll probably come back to that, but it's worth thinking, what is the young person or child that you're caring for most anxious about? Okay, now this is an important bit, I think, because anxiety can show itself in all sorts of ways. And when this crisis started, I know there were lots of reports about people becoming a bit, perhaps kind of aggressive in shops. And it really struck me at the time that actually, when people are anxious, sometimes it can come out in that way. So let's just run through some of the ways anxiety can show up, particularly in children, but actually in adults as well. So children very much might be restless and unable to concentrate or focus. Now, obviously, it's a new situation, children being at home, but they might even find it hard to concentrate on things that usually they would like and get absorbed in. They could become upset or tearful without apparent cause. They could be withdrawn and quiet, but they can also be defiant, and they might refuse to follow even very reasonable requests. Now, I know you're busy thinking, well, heck, they're children. And yes, some children might be quite defiant. That might be something you struggle with your child all the time. It's certainly something that can happen in phases. But if a child is anxious, it can often come out with them being quite defiant and refusing to follow even very reasonable requests. If you think about adults, and children are not so different in some ways, when we're anxious, we can often be quite snappy and irritable because our mind is elsewhere. We're not concentrating. We're not attending to other people. We're perhaps not picking up on their feelings in quite the same way. So being snappy and irritable is definitely a feature of people being anxious. Children might avoid certain tasks if they're anxious. So if you find that they are constantly avoiding things, it's worth thinking, I wonder if they're anxious about something to do with that. As I mentioned before, they can have a lack of interest that they usually like in things that they usually like. And I think they can also be, when we look at the next slide, they can also be lacking in motivation generally. But I think it's a real highlighter to think if it's something they normally like and they're not liking it anymore, it's worth kind of thinking, I wonder if they're anxious. They can be very angry over things that seem quite trivial to us. They might become aggressive with quite little provocation, and obviously at the minute a lot of children are trapped at home, possibly spending a lot more time with siblings than they normally would, and that's often where that would come out. But similar, they could also be feeling quite clingy, needing a lot of reassurance, maybe about where you're going, where you're going to, if you are able to go out, or certainly if people have parents that are still going out to work, they could be quite anxious about that and asking for lots of reassurance. But they can also ask lots of questions or want to be constantly reminded of plans. But anxiety can also cause physical symptoms. So things like a loss of appetite or indeed wanting to eat more. Sometimes that can be from boredom. They could have difficulty in falling asleep or wake in the night and then not be able to get back to sleep. But on the other hand, they could be quite apathetic or saying that they're tired all of the time. They could be presenting with a load of different aches and pains, so headaches, tummy aches, general aches and pains, or they could be just complaining that they're not feeling well. And it is important to remember that anxiety can show itself quite physically. So, if a child is very, very anxious, what can you do? Well, the first thing is to be calm yourself, especially if they are not calm. So if they're very tearful or if they're angry and shouting, then the best thing you can do is be calm. I'm not saying it's easy. It's therefore very important that we take care of our own self-care so that we can be calm and help our children to remain calm. Be close. Physical proximity when you're upset is very comforting. So obviously it must be in an age-appropriate way. You might need to leave it a minute or two before you can go physically quite close to them if they're particularly upset. But physical closeness can be very reassuring for children. Also being really connected, so trying to have good eye contact, even if you're not saying anything, even if they're upset and you're just with them, but you're with them and you are making eye contact and you're being physically close, perhaps hugging them or holding their hands or whatever is appropriate for you and your child. Being reassuring is important too, explaining that you know it's tough for them, but that you're going to help them. If you know what they're specifically worrying about, you can try and be reassuring about that, but you may not know. Also being present to yourself, give them your full attention. This is not the time to be having one eye on the phone, but actually give them your full attention, and suggest, perhaps we'll look at this next, about that you breathe together so that you can help the child get their breathing under control, and be a listener. It might be that they're able to tell you what you're thinking or what they are thinking or worrying about, and if they do, then you need to listen and don't trivialize it. It's important to them, therefore it's important. Okay, so in terms of calming down, the best way to start is to getting the breathing under control. Now you can do this with just a few deep breaths. If you're with a child, a good way to do it is to get eye contact, to hold their hands and suggest that they breathe with you, and do a few deep breaths, counting in for maybe 4 or 6 and then counting out. Or you could do a short mindfulness thing from YouTube. There are lots of short mindful exercises that you can, again, do together. You can breathe through it together. If that's not something that you find very easy, then sometimes a grounding exercise can help. There's one called 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, where you use the different senses, looking for things you can see, things you can hear, things you can taste, things you can touch. And so you can work through that, and that's a very helpful exercise to do. But give children time, trying to get them talking about their feelings, because what you don't want them to do is kind of bottle it up too much. But it's often easiest to talk while they're engaged in another activity. For example, walking or drawing or doing almost anything else, where they're free to talk to you, but without feeling it's terribly intense, sitting opposite and all you're doing is talking. If they can't articulate how they feel, then sometimes it's useful to wonder aloud and simply saying things like, I wonder if you're feeling a bit worried about grandma, or whatever you think might be at the root of it. Yes, you might get it wrong. The purpose is not to try and put ideas in their head of things they hadn't worried about, but using your best guess of knowing your child, knowing what's happened, trying to suggest things that you think might be going on. And of course, they'll often say, no, I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about this. So encouraging them to talk is really good, and obviously then making sure that you give them time so you can listen. So getting them to do something. Really, a great way to reduce anxiety is simply changing your position. So change where you are, change what you're doing. So for children, just moving rooms, going to get a drink, go and have a snack. Those kind of things can be very, very helpful. For adults too, things like just getting up, going to have a shower, moving to a different room, really practical and helpful. Distractions can work brilliantly. So get them immersed in a good book or watching a film, baking a cake, almost anything. The more absorbing, the better. Now, things like films can be really good because sometimes they'll want to watch one they've seen before it's very comforting. Others might enjoy watching something new because that's very absorbing. It absolutely depends on the age and stage of your child. If you can find something to laugh about, then that's even better. Connecting with someone, it's one of our key ways of getting support. So encourage them to call a relative or a friend. Join with them another child on an internet game or via a Zoom or there's a new app, isn't there, the House Party app. But I know lots of children are using Zoom to actually have group meetings with other family members or other children. But if they can't do that, simply sending a message or a photo, anything that helps them feel like they are connected with the people that are important to them. Help them to reframe their thoughts. Just remind them that their thoughts, especially if they've told you what they are, sometimes they are just thoughts. They're not reality. We all have a habit, don't we, of worrying about things that aren't actually happening yet. And try and think of some good outcomes. So if they're, say, worrying that they might not see grandma for a long time, then explain that they can have a FaceTime with her or they can have a Zoom thing. Try and put a positive angle on what their worry is. That's quite different from trivializing it. It's just saying, well, that is an issue, but here's what we can do about it. And getting creative. We know that creativity can help us calm. So build creative activities into your daily routine. Schoolwork is important. A lot of schoolwork can be creative, but whatever you're doing, build in some creative activities. So painting, drawing, gardening, baking, listening to or making music, sewing, or anything else that springs to mind. Creative things help us calm. We also know that going outdoors helps us calm, and at the minute we still can. So nature can have a really calming effect, but of course, it maybe that's restricted. It maybe you don't live near any of parks or anything like that. So if they, if you can't walk outdoors, then even just going into the garden can be good. If that isn't possible, then the next best thing is looking at nature or watching some natural world and wildlife programs. There is something quite calming and relaxing about nature. Things like the sound of the sea, the sound of the wind in the trees, and there are a lot of YouTube videos and sound clips that you can use. Also, exercise, terribly good for us. If we can go outside, then that's really good. But if not, then things like the workout to YouTube, the old Joe Wicks who is sweeping the nation at the moment, or a yoga session, or some dancing to music, or an active game like Twister, or using the Wii Fit, or even simple exercises in a small space like sit-ups or star jumps. And lastly, I think it's important to encourage gratitude. If it's part of that being positivity, when we make ourselves focus on the positive, it really can help us reduce anxiety. So encourage children to think about things that they do have rather than what they don't have. You can create a gratitude jar, which is a great example. You just stick in a little thing every day that you're grateful for, or you can have a gratitude tree where you draw the outline of a tree on some paper. You can stick it on a wall or a cupboard, and then every day they can write a little leaf of gratitude that they stick to it. But remember, these are strange, unprecedented times, and being anxious is probably what we'd expect. So it's okay not to be okay. Helping them calm their anxiety isn't saying it's not all right. It's saying it's not a pleasant feeling, but this is what we can do with it. So I hope you found it helpful, and I hope we get the chance to connect again in some future training. But for now, I will say cheerio, and remember to be kind to yourself. You are doing your best in these difficult times. Many thanks now.